I'm Xiaobei Chen, Professor of Sociology at Carleton University and the President of the Canadian Sociological Association. On behalf of the association, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the CSA webinar series on Canadian policing, colonialism, and racism. I'm opening today's meeting with a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge the Indigenous nations on whose lands we are meeting today, wherever that may be, to thank them for the opportunity to present our thoughts on their territories. We would also like to pay our respects to elders of these lands, both past and present. As a speaker and moderator at the University of Alberta, it is also appropriate to have land acknowledgement from there. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that it is located on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. As the debate about policing is becoming a major contentious issue for sociology departments across the country and for Canadian society, it is important that we create public space for discussions about these issues among sociologists and with the wider community. Our speaker today is Dr. Temitope Oriola. Dr. Temitope Oriola is Joint Editor-in-Chief of African Security and Associate Professor of Criminology and Sociology at the University of Alberta. A recipient of the Governor-General of Canada Academic Gold Medal, Professor Oriola's research focuses on policing, weaponization and use of force by police, terrorism studies, resource wars or insurgencies, and political kidnapping. A decorated researcher and teacher, Dr. Oriola regularly contributes to public scholarship through public talk, op-eds, television and radio interviews, and expert opinions. Professor Oriola is a two-time recipient of the prestigious Carnegie Fellowship, the 2020 recipient of the Kathleen W. Kalaway Award for Excellence in Teaching, and the president of the Canadian Association of African Studies. We are very grateful today to have Dr. Oriola joining us and give us a presentation titled At the Crossroads, Sociologists, Policing and Social Justice. Today's webinar is moderated by Dr. Sara Dorow. Professor Dorow is also chair at the Department of Sociology at University of Alberta. She is the former founding director of the Community Service Learning Program at the University of Alberta. Her areas of research and teaching are focused on transnationalism, migration, and mobile work, gender, race, and family, and qualitative methodologies and community-engaged learning. After focusing these interests on transracial adoptive families and identities in the first part of her career, she has turned her sights on community and work in the oil sands in the second part. Part 3 is in the works. Thank you so much, Tope and Sara, for joining us. And thank you all for attending this afternoon's event. Sara, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Xiaobei, very much. And I'm really pleased to be a part of this event today. I'm going to briefly introduce the format for the event and welcome you to pose your questions. So Tope will speak for 35 to 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A period after his remarks. You'll see on the screen here that we invite you to communicate with the panelists during the webinar, and you can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and that's where the toolbar appears. You can also pose questions through the Q&A, and we invite you to do that. You can pose questions during the talk and or after Tope has concluded his remarks. Please note that in the Q&A function, there's the opportunity for you to also upvote questions. So if there are questions you especially like or echo what you would ask, then please do upvote them, and we'll use that to guide our Q&A. So thank you, and I'll pass things over to Dr. Tope Oriola.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'd like to start by thanking the president of the Canadian Sociological Association, Dr. Xiaobei Chen, the moderator, Dr. Sara Dorow, and Shelley Fox, the executive director of the Canadian Sociological Association. Thanks for all your hard work behind the scenes to make today's event possible. I appreciate our colleagues in the media who have taken time off their busy schedules to join us today. And thanks, of course, to the audience, colleagues, students at all levels, and members of the public. Some caveats are crucial at this early stage. First, while I recognize that the term sociologist applies to a broad spectrum of academic and non-academic professionals, my primary focus is on individuals in the nearly 100 universities in Canada with tenured or tenure-track positions. This is a rather limited scope for reasons that should soon become obvious. It means that I am directing this presentation to a small slice of the 28.5% of Canadians with a bachelor's degree or higher, or a tiny proportion of the less than 1% of the Canadian population with a PhD. A critique of elitism, therefore, is in order, but that precisely underscores my point. Second, I am a continental African, born and raised in post-colonial Nigeria. That means I am socialized for the greater part to think in terms of socioeconomic status rather than race. Therefore, social agitation or disadvantage based on race is something relatively new to me. Third, I have zero negative experience with the police in Canada. The implication is that my arguments as both a scholar and a Black male are unencumbered by any personal negative experience or grievance. Of course, I am aware and reflexive of the fact that I am one of the less than 20 Black tenured or tenure-track professors at the U of A out of a total of 2,059 professors. That positionality comes with certain privileges. There are, of course, the interactional minutiae and intersubjective micro-sociological dimensions. As I shared in a recent presentation to my department's newly minted Center for Criminological Research, one US border agent told me a couple of years back, as I breezed through the fast lane as a Nexus Global Travel member, "Let me guess, you're either a medical doctor or a professor." I smiled and told him one of his suggestions was accurate, but he would likely not survive it if I operated on any part of his body. My left hand is more active than my right, although I am in fact right-handed. And apparently such lack of coordination of hands is not good for surgery. Similarly, in other social spaces in everyday life, people routinely tell me that I look like a pastor. Now that often sounds like a cruel joke given the condition and the size of my faith. So having noted all three caveats, here we go. George Floyd was killed in a police encounter on the streets of Minneapolis on 25th May 2020. Floyd's digitized and widely disseminated asphyxiation through that knee on the neck has led to global protests against police violence and other forms of oppression. From the UK to Canada, Belgium to Australia, social movements have taken off with the explicit aim of demanding the removal, or in some cases, outright destruction of historical monuments and other symbols of colonialism and slavery. Calls for defunding the police have also grown. So has solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot has changed, and much remains unchanged since George Floyd's death. 2 days after George Floyd died, Toronto Black woman, Regis Koczynski-Packet, died from a fall shortly after police responded to her family's call for assistance to deal with her mental crisis. Video evidence from the incident were not made public, but selective leaks appeared in the Toronto Sun. Ontario Police Oversight Organization, the Special Investigations Unit, SIU, noted that, and I'm quoting now, leaks of this nature detract from the public's confidence and the family's confidence in the integrity of the SIU investigation, unquote. The integrity and the victimhood of the dead woman were seemingly questioned in the leaks. On June 6th, Chief Alan Adam of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nations released a video regarding his maltreatment by a wood buffalo RCMP in Fort McMurray. The chief noted that, I'm quoting him now, "I could feel that I was going unconscious, and all I can remember is the blood gushing out of my mouth," unquote. The picture of his bloodied face was widely disseminated. The reason for the encounter with police was an expired license plate. The RCMP charged the chief with resisting arrest and unlawful assault of a police officer. The RCMP officer knocked down an Inuk man with a car door earlier in the same week. 2 federal ministers expressed their outrage over the chief's abuse. The prime minister said he was, quote, deeply alarmed by the incident. The charges against the chief were dropped about 2 weeks later. Since George Floyd's murder, several student associations have challenged sociology departments regarding police violence, their ties to the police, and broader action on social injustice. It seemed that students expected more from us as academics and researchers they associated with the quest for social justice. As I told graduating criminology undergrad students in a recorded faculty message in the summer, one of the benefits of having a PhD in a social science is that you acquire mastery of the language of social justice. We have passed that on to you through our interactions with you within and outside the classroom. Truth is, we do not always live up to those ideals you heard us talk about. And my colleagues and I hope that you go farther than us and be a voice for meaningful change wherever you may be. Nonetheless, in August 2020, the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Carleton University ended student internships with police and correctional services. The Institute noted that, quote, producing transformative change requires decentering the police and prisons in our collective efforts to reimagine how we govern harm, engage with social problems, and articulate our desires for a more just, a more humane, and a more egalitarian society, unquote. The decision has attracted both commendation and criticism. The debate over the Institute's decision presents an opportunity to examine the role of sociologists in the global movement against police brutality and social injustice. This presentation addresses 2 main questions. What is the role of sociologists in the debate over police violence and social injustice? How can sociology departments respond to the underlying call for action on equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. My central argument is bifurcated. First, sociologists have been too complacent regarding social injustice. And second, sociology as a discipline runs the risk of irrelevance and ridicule if sociologists do not make use of this moment to articulate where they stand in the ongoing movement against police violence. Now let's contemplate a little clarification. What is the role of sociology? This has historically been a matter of serious debate. From the Arab scholar Ibn Khaldun, whose work Muqaddimah focused on what he called asabiya, or social cohesion, which he believed was responsible for the ascendance of clans or tribal groups to power and the inherent seeds for their concomitant downfall, to Auguste Comte, who considers sociology a positive science devoted to searching for invariant laws of the natural and social world. Sociology is a societal barometer. British philosopher Peter Winch, in his 1958 book called The Idea of a Social Science, argues that, quote, the central problem of sociology, that of giving an account of the nature of social phenomena in general, itself belongs to philosophy. In fact, this part of sociology is really misbegotten epistemology. I say misbegotten because its problems have been largely misconstrued and therefore mishandled as a species of scientific problem, unquote. In other words, for Peter Winch, sociology should not be an empirical science, but a branch of philosophy. Now let's just say that many sociologists were not particularly pleased with such effrontery. In The Poverty of Historicism, first published in 1957, philosopher Karl Popper notes that sociology is, quote, an attempt to solve the whole problem of foretelling the future, not so much the future of the individual as that of groups and of the human race. It is the science of things to come, of impending developments. If the attempt to furnish the political foresight of scientific validity were to succeed, then sociology would prove to be of the greatest value to politicians, especially to those whose vision extends beyond the exigencies of the present, to politicians with a sense of historic destiny, unquote. Popper goes to argue that sociological study should help reveal the political future and that it could thereby become the foremost instrument of far-sighted, practical politics. Now, while the capacity of any discipline to tell the future is debatable, that should not detract from Karl Popper's broader point. Karl Popper takes for granted the ability of sociology to showcase excellent policy-relevant research. In Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle points out that human excellence is of two kinds, the intellectual and the moral. Aristotle argues that the intellectual, quote, springs originally and is increased subsequently from teaching, unquote. To that may be added learning. What I find most salient in Aristotle's point about moral virtues is his argument that, quote, matters of moral action and expediency have no fixedness, but must be left to the individual agents to look to the exigencies of the particular case as it is in the art of healing or that of navigating a ship, unquote. Emil Durkheim, as we all know, focused on broad macro-level variables and their impact on individual action rather than vice versa. And I return to this theme in the concluding part of my presentation. The volume of work being produced within Canadian sociology and the expansion of the discipline suggests that the discipline remains well and alive in its intellectual pursuit. But how are we doing with respect to what Aristotle conceives as the second part of human excellence, moral excellence? Are we right to stay silent, or to use my favorite description of the state of affairs, neutral in the global movement against social injustice, of which policing is a small but fundamental part. As Howard Becker noted in 1967, the question is not whether we should take sides. And I'm quoting Becker now. The question is not whether we should take sides, since we inevitably will, but rather, whose side are we on? Unquote. What kind of sociology do we wish to produce in Canada? To decide to stay neutral in this moment is to take a position of prior willful blindness. In late 2008, Nicole Neverson from Ryerson University, Charles T. Adeyanju from the University of Prince Edward Island, and I began to conduct research on use of electromagnetic disruption technologies or conducted energy weapons such as tasers in Canada. The research was influenced by the televised death of Polish immigrant Robert Zikansky on the floor of the Vancouver airport, growing fatalities following deployment of tools such as tasers, and overall limited research in the Canadian literature. Our first publication, which was released in 2010, is a pioneering work on police use of conducted energy weapons and its social consequences in Canada. My colleagues and I warned against what we termed a new urban terrorism. This was in 2012, the publication after the first one, particularly within city spaces, the amphitheater of sociopolitical contestation. We problematized the gaze of law enforcement on poor, mentally challenged, racialized individuals rendered concurrently visible and invisible by law enforcement. We argued that it was time to, quote, re-theorize the notion of urban terrorism in recognition of the economy of violence that the downtrodden face in socially devalued city spaces and interactions with police. This has been proven prescient by recent events. Analysis from a CBC database on use of deadly force by police from the year 2000 to June 2020 demonstrate that 16% of those killed by police are indigenous, while Black people comprise 8.63% of victims. These numbers are alarming, given that indigenous people and Black people constitute 4.21% and 2.92% of the Canadian population, respectively. The report notes that the year 2020 has, quote, already been a particularly deadly year in terms of people killed in encounters with police in Canada, unquote. As I look back, nearly 12 years after commencing research on police use of force in Canada, I recall the difficulty in publishing findings. Our research team challenged academic reticence regarding how police deployed force. Initial external reviews were quite scathing, often on conservative ideological grounds, rather than what was lacking in the submission or ways in which they could be improved. We got some very angry reviews. Thankfully, we have since published in several of the same outlets that rejected our initial submissions on police use of force. Those publications have largely been on less controversial global criminological issues. Some politicians are now far ahead of academic sociologists on the matter of police violence and social justice generally. Karl Popper, who largely thought highly of sociology, would be shocked that sociologists no longer charted society's path. So would Aristotle, Martin Luther King Jr., Hannah Arendt, Obafemi Awolowo, the Madiba, Nelson Mandela, and so forth, who thought scholars, and by implication, education, had enormous power to bring about social change. There are sociologists who still presuppose that taking a clear stance against police violence means you are biased. Others simply remain silent and continue to work on the fine, rigorous paper that will be read most likely by 121 people after 7 years, mostly by grad students for whom it is required reading. It is remarkable that some politicians are now ahead of the curve relative to sociologists on matters of social justice. One example may suffice. RCMP Commissioner Brenda Locke informed the Globe and Mail on June 10th, so just over 2 weeks after George Floyd died, that, quote, "I have to admit, I really struggle with the term systemic racism. I have heard about 5 or 10 different definitions on TV. I think that if systemic racism is meaning that racism is entrenched in our policies and procedures, I would say that we don't have systemic racism," unquote. When asked about the commissioner's statement a day later, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau informed the media that, and I'm quoting Justin Trudeau now, "Systemic racism is an issue right across the country, in all our institutions, including in all of our police forces, including in the RCMP. That's what systemic racism is," unquote. It was a direct response to Commissioner Locke. Barely 24 hours after the Prime Minister's comments and 2 days after her initial remarks, Commissioner Locke changed her perspective, clarifying, among other things, that, and I'm quoting the Commissioner now, "I did not say definitively that systemic racism exists in the RCMP. I should have," unquote. Perhaps the RCMP commissioner came across some fine, incontrovertible, nomothetic socio-scientific data hours after the Prime Minister's comments. Alberta RCMP Deputy Commissioner Cody Zablocki also walked away from his earlier stance. And I found the episode quite fascinating. The point is, the Prime Minister communicated a strong and unambiguous political position. The RCMP commissioner was arguably aware she could not maintain her curious position discursively and literally while at odds with the standpoint of the federal government. The Prime Minister busted the institutional happy talk of the RCMP. Apologies to Sara Ahmed. This is interesting, coming from a head of government whose survival depends on public opinion, essentially being liked by the public, while fully tenured university professors wish to remain neutral in the face of suffering of fellow citizens. I can understand neutrality from grad students and contract or sessional instructors who are in a precarious situation, but I do not understand why a tenured university professor, a sociologist no less, thinks that speaking against police violence or social injustice compromises their academic credibility. Now that demonstrates a basic misunderstanding of the role of the scholar in society and the positionality of the sociologist. To be fair, this has long been a point of concern. C. Wright Mills notes in his book, The Images of Man, published in 1960, and I'm quoting C. Wright Mills now, how different social scientists go about their work and what they aim to accomplish by it often do not seem to have a common denominator. Let us admit the case of our critics from the humanities and from the experimental sciences. Social science as a whole is both intellectually and morally confused, and what is called sociology is very much in the middle of this confusion. Unquote. Those were the words of C. Wright Mills. 60 years after those words were printed, it is debatable that C. Wright Mills was wrong. The widely acknowledged conservative nature of sociology has been linked to its intellectual indebtedness to the American Midwest. Sociologists, as Leon Tsiolkovsky points out, have been influenced by, quote, the bedrock of both moderate conservative political thinking and of moderate reform philosophy, unquote. In other words, Tsiolkovsky's argument is that we seem to have a profound inclination towards half measures. Human history is full of supposed neutrality, complicity, and active participation of academics at various historical moments. Phrenology and craniology played a huge role in the historical justification of slavery. Anthropology played a role in colonialism. Anthropologists are still viewed as suspect in some developing countries to this day. The humanities were entangled in the Nazi enterprise. Some philosophers in particular played a role in Nazi Germany. In the book, Nazi Germany and the Humanities, How German Academics Embraced Nazism, published just in 2007, Wolfgang Bialas and Anselm Rabinbach note, and I'm quoting them now, the complex ways in which scholars in a variety of disciplines were able to advance their careers during the Third Reich by lending their skills and professional expertise to well-funded national research communities and to the wartime mobilization of the humanities, unquote. Citing Stephen P. Remy's study of Heidelberg University, Bialas and Rabinbach argue that, quote, with few exceptions, the academic elite welcomed and justified the acts of the Nazi regime, uttered not a word of protest when their Jewish and liberal colleagues were dismissed, nor raised a stare when Jewish students were barred admission, unquote. Canada is not Nazi Germany. Canada is a free and liberal democratic society, easily one of the finest in the world by my reckoning. Consequently, we can assume that each member of the professoriate is an agentic entity, and whatever constrains their actions is likely a matter of free will or relatively mild, tepid circumstances. Therefore, no one is forcing any scholar to join a national political movement. The life of any sociologist in Canada, to my knowledge, is not at stake on this matter. Sociologists have a choice regarding how we engage with the issue of police violence and social injustice. In particular, sociologists of crime, criminologists, must be careful about how they lend their voice and expertise at this historical juncture. Is research access worth the damage to your reputation? Despite how many exciting research agendas across Canada, as evident in national and international publications, there seems to be, on one hand, an immanent ultra-conservative bias on matters relating to the criminal justice process, and on the other hand, the presupposition that our job ends on the altar of analysis and publication of findings. My point is, we must not justify or rationalize police violence. Our task must also go beyond merely publishing findings and advancing our careers. Sociologists ought to be part of the epicenter of the global movement to eradicate social injustice. Commitment to such an endeavor is not momentary, ephemeral, or an exercise in rhetorical performativity. The change may, in fact, begin with academia or within academia. Various departments, units, and faculties ought to evaluate policies and practices undergirding their hiring decisions, promotion, merit incrementation, award nomination, or decision-making regarding students and faculty, as well as appointment to administrative positions, among others. At the micro-sociological level, I'm often surprised that there are some scholars with 20, 25-year experience who have never, in fact, mentored a single minority student. There are scholars receiving funding on social problems affecting specific communities, but have never hired a single member of that community as a research assistant. Some departments in the social sciences are close to reaching gender parity. This is a welcome development. However, opportunities for women in academia has not necessarily translated to opportunities for women of all backgrounds. My point is that sociologists must challenge the status quo. Discourses on terms such as social justice, deconstruction, and the beautiful intersectionality and social inequality, among others, must go beyond the phraseology of the trade, or what I call academy's chatter, by people with PhDs. Talcott Parsons, one of the major figures of the discipline, understood the significance of individual actions in his general theory of action systems. Parsons argued, and I'm quoting Parsons now, a social system is only one of three aspects of the structuring of a completely concrete system of social action. The other two are the personality systems of the individual actors and the cultural system which is built into their action. Each of the three must be considered to be an independent focus of the organization of the elements of the action system, in the sense that no one of them, and this is crucial, no one of them, my apologies, I'm losing my line in. The other two are the personality systems of the individual actors and the cultural system, which is built into their action. Each of the three must be considered to be an independent focus of the organization of the elements of the action system, in the sense that no one of them is theoretically reducible to terms of one or a combination of the other. No one of them is theoretically reducible to terms of one or a combination of the other two. My point is, each individual sociologist has a role to play despite external constraints. There is no basis in law or morality for the kind of egregious actions we have witnessed for some time now. This is not a call for slacktivism or activism. Clicking like or sharing a post on social media is one thing. What cause we support in real life, how we vote when it matters, and our contributions to major or minor decisions within our sphere of influence all go a long way to promote or stifle social justice. In Equality and Democracy, Philip Green warns against, quote, a politics of victimization in which there is no sympathy for suffering in general, but only sympathy for the suffering of people who are exactly like oneself, unquote. We may replace the term sympathy in that quote from Philip Green with the term support. We must learn to support those who are unlike us. As academics, the society imbues in us a level of respect that is rarely accorded people in several other professions. Martin Luther King Jr. puts it best in his autobiography, and a rarely quoted part of his work. He states, and I quote now, "When you are aware that you are a symbol, it causes you to search your soul constantly, to go through this job of self-analysis, to see if you live up to the high and noble principles that people surround you with, and to try at all times to keep the gulf between the public self and the private self at a minimum," unquote. A new society is possible. I was encouraged by the 15,000 strong Black Lives Matter protests in Edmonton in June this year. I am encouraged by the largely nonviolent demonstrations in my country of birth, Nigeria, where the political elite had for decades failed to deliver good governance and trampled on the talents and destinies of millions of young people. I'm encouraged by the refusal of young people around the world to fall into familiar silos of tribe and tongue. I'm encouraged by the demands being made by students across Canada for decolonizing academia and ensuring diversity in the professoriate and social justice in our universities. I am confident that a new society can emerge from the tumult of the present age. Ashe púpọ̀. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tope, for that stimulating talk and lots to chew on and think about there, and really appreciate it. So we'll open it up to Q&A, and I don't see any questions posed there yet, but we'll give people a minute to collect their thoughts and pose a question in the Q&A, and then I'll share them with Tope when you're ready. And please don't be shy. There's plenty for us to talk about. We'll give people a minute. So there's a question, can you speak to SARS in Nigeria right now as part of a failure to give good governance?
Right. Well, thank you for that. Now, SARS was established decades ago, I believe in the 1980s, as this special anti-robbery squad, but has since become a law unto itself. Successive administrations kept it alive for, of course, their own purposes, but there have also been multiple instances, I believe up to 5 times in the last 10 years, when SARS was in fact supposedly banned, but somehow, like a cat with multiple lives, it just kept coming back. So the making of what we're seeing now regarding SARS has been long coming. And in fact, a lot of individuals who have observed Nigeria or lived in Nigeria for a while are wondering why it took so long for the masses to take to the streets to demand for their rights. A part of that, of course, is the mass exodus of some of the finest brains out of the country in the last several years, and so spread all across the world, US, Canada, and so forth. But it's nice to see that awakening. Personally, I think it's long overdue. We hope that the protests generate the desired change in Nigeria. But this is, in my mind, resistance from below.
Great, thank you, Tope. We'll just wait to see if more questions pop up here. While we're waiting, I'll go ahead and pose one. Because your talk, I think I have about 3 or 4, but something that's certainly on my mind as you were talking was the sort of need to decolonize sociology itself, right, as a discipline. And so your invitation urging for sociology to be at the front end, right, of social justice and social change also pushes the question of how we look at our own roots, our own the research methods and theories that we espouse or not. And so I wonder if you might speak to sort of the relationship between sort of how we look at our discipline and its very formation in relation to this how it's incumbent on us to be part of and at the head of social conversations.
Right. Well, thank you for that. So I believe we have the ingredients to be at the very forefront of social justice advocacy in a way that would not jeopardize our academic credibility. In terms of the kinds of research we do, the degree of symbolic power that members of society invest in us. When you're introduced as a university professor of any discipline, people listen, at least for the greater part. People listen. They want to hear what you have to say. But I find this reticence, this reluctance, so that the society is one thing, and then academia is another. We just remain in our highly private cocoon and just do our thing, content to publish, those papers in the best journals we can find, and then whether or not the findings are used or useful for anything, isn't really our business, and so on. So that is something that we need to change. One of the lessons that I learned personally over the course of the summer was the need to engage the public in vis-a-vis sharing research findings. Just a single article about 1,200 to 1,400 words in the conversation went viral, was republished by over 20 media organizations within and outside Canada, and I had never seen that level of interest in the kinds of work that we do. Now, and interestingly, a lot of the findings that I put together, but the ones that my research team had done and the ones from other scholars, were things that we had published a decade ago, 8 years ago, but we never bothered to actually put the findings out there. And we assume that the average member of the public has time for a 10,000 word essay. guess what? They don't. So I think it then makes sense for us to start, thinking of this short editorial or op-ed pieces easily accessible from our major thicker research findings and ensure that we make them available to the public. And we will be amazed at how interested members of the public are in the things that we do. So others may choose to join protests and all of that. I'm not necessarily calling for that, but I believe there are things that we can do as scholars to have an engaged public and to put our voice out there on these social issues of our time.
Great, thank you very much. We have just a message from one of the audience members, Joseph, to say thank you very much. It really has learned a lot from the presentation. While we're waiting for other questions, we've got a couple popping up here. So I'll take one from the Q&A, Xiaobei, and then we'll go to you. This question is, what responsibility do our universities have to shield us from the dangers of public intellectualism and the ways those dangers are racialized and gendered?
That's an interesting one, because on the one hand, in the last a couple of decades, there has been that the push, at least in some quarters, towards public intellectualism. And not all of those public intellectuals were necessarily scholars. Oftentimes, you would have someone who attained the stature of a public intellectual simply because they have published a book that was very well received, and therefore they became perceived as experts in the area, and then began to have speaking engagements in those issues and so on and so forth. And there have been a few cases where academics, some of them tenured, took on that role. For those who were in fact non-academics, whose only claim to public intellectualism is because of one or two media articles or a book that they published, what they have done is to occupy a space that scholars did not feel. And so in a certain sense, there was a vacuum, and therefore individuals are going into it. I do not consider that public intellectualism is wrong or abhorrent in and of itself. The question is, who are the public intellectuals? And what is their qualification? What is their pedigree to speak to those issues for which they claim expertise? I think that's the major issue. And as long as we remain in our offices or homes now that there is COVID going on, and do not get into the public sphere, into the public debate, we're going to have all kinds of characters coming up to claim that space. And I'm sure that pretty much every one of us has had instances where you see someone in the media speaking about an issue, and if you didn't know the person, you wonder what their expertise is to speak on that issue, because you probably know them or know what their qualifications might be. So that arises because we've abdicated that responsibility, and scholars have to get into the public sphere some more while still remaining grounded in academics. And yeah, those are my thoughts about that. I think we should get involved in the public sphere.
That would also seem to speak to sociology's sort of responsibility towards a kind of literacy, right? And that overused phrase, critical thinking, right? For people actually engaging with and making sense of public intellectual proclamations. So thank you.
Right.
Xiaobei had a question.
Yes, I can't access Q&A, so I'm just going to ask a question this way. Tope, thank you so much for your really insightful and brilliant presentation and pleading for soul searching among sociologists. I'm curious about your classroom, how your classroom is like, how you inspire your students to pursue not just intellectual excellence, but also moral excellence. I ask that because I think that's something that we should all do. So I want to, hear what you do and get some insights from that. And another related question is also, universities today are very different. We have been thoroughly restructured by neoliberalist, corporatist, changes. So I think, to what extent do you think the depoliticization of those processes is also part of the problem of us remaining quiet and silent as sociologists?
Xiaobei, I'll just add to that. Thank you. Tope, there's a question in the Q&A also about teaching, so I thought I'd just tack that on to Xiaobei's question about the classroom. There's a question, could you discuss if you see our teaching as being part of our social activism?
Okay, so internet was unstable, so I missed the second half of Xiaobei's question. But I'm happy to respond on the whole issue of engaging students as regards moral excellence and so forth. Now, part of what I try to do is to get students involved or engaged in issues that do not directly concern them, by providing a transnational globalist approach to teaching and learning. So in one breath of responding to a question, giving them illustrations from countries as diverse as Canada, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Nigeria, Belgium, and so forth, particularly my graduate seminars and undergrad seminars. It's easier, obviously, to do that in those settings than the larger sort of classes, but even in those, I introduce topics that are perhaps not conventional for those courses. So for my intro criminology class, for instance, I bring on issues of counter-terrorist strategies by liberal democratic states. And in the case of Canada, the use of what is called the security certificate provision, which is a tiny part of a law, a 1978 law in Canada that allows the state to detain you indefinitely. And I show a video clip of a family man who was held on this certificate and the implications. And I then give room for students to interact. I think students know a lot more than we give them credit for. I do not see students as tabula rasa or blank pieces of paper. I think they know quite a bit. And that if we work with them and if we acknowledge them and engage them based on where they are and what they know, I think we will be positively amazed at the response that they bring, the glow on their faces, that they're learning these new topics, they're learning about these new geographies, about individuals they may never meet and issues affecting those lives and why they should care about those issues. So that's been my approach with respect to moral excellence.
Maybe the question about social activism in relation to teaching as well. You began to answer that, I think, but I wondered if you wanted to say anything more.
Right. So if you can just restate that again. My internet was unstable and I didn't get it. Yeah.
It was a question in the Q&A about the role of social activism in relation to teaching.
Yeah. So I think one of what we can do is. Again, depending on what discipline you are, what subfield, what you're teaching, I would expect with the whole SARS protest in Nigeria, that someone somewhere would develop a course around that, the sociogenesis of that. So our courses have to be living, breathing organisms in terms of their design, in terms of their content and the context that they tackle. And so it comes from that, but also illustrations that we give in class. That means they would have to have contemporaneity and the legal of those illustrations. And so I just by virtue of the kinds of courses that I teach, I have to be abreast of what's going on in the news and so on, because these are essential to the things that I teach. So if there was, say, a terrorist attack somewhere last night, you bet one of my students will bring that up in class this morning. That's just how it works. So I have to be abreast of things. So I think that's one way. The design of our courses, in the kinds of illustrations we use in class, in the themes that we introduce. Even if we can't have an entire course devoted to that, let's have a lecture or a couple of lectures devoted to these things, and give room for student comment and feedback, and then have this dialogic process of engaging them. I think we would go a long way. Obviously, we can't tell them, oh, you should go and march on the streets, and so that's entirely left to them. But I think when they understand the issues, I think it does go a long way. A colleague emailed me as recently as last night that they were not going to be at this talk today because they had a meeting that clashed with this talk. But they wanted to let me know that their grade 10 daughter had been following several of my public activities and op-eds and media interviews and so forth, as well as a colleague in the faculty of law. So you'll be amazed. There is real hunger for these issues. There's real hunger to help people understand what is going on around them, to make sense of our world. And so I believe there's a need for us to embrace that role a lot more than we are currently doing.
Thank you. We have a few more questions in the Q&A, but Xiaobei, I think you had a second part to your question.
I think I'll cede that to other attendees.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Thank
Okay,
you.
a couple of people asking questions with regard to policing and alternatives to policing. So I'll try to combine them. One person writes, as a student in criminology, I'm working with well-established criminological theories that take police for granted as belonging in society. How do you recommend engaging with these theories in a way that acknowledges that alternatives, such as defunding of police, are possible? And then another person asks, can you speak to sociologists' role in exploring alternatives to policing and defunding policing institutions?
Right. So thank you for that. I was praying someone would ask that, so I'm glad that this came up. And I've written about this through op-eds and so forth. There are two perspectives. This is my characterization of this contemporary issue. There are two perspectives on defunding police. One, again, this is the view of left-leaning groups on the far left, groups like Antifa and so forth, who believe that policing is fundamentally and absolutely broken and cannot be fixed. And the solution is to cancel it, abolish it completely. That is one perspective. The second perspective holds that much of what counts as policing today, in fact, has little to do with conventional policing. The police have usurped roles and duties for which A, they are ill-equipped, B, that they execute poorly and to devastating consequences. So for instance, a growing proportion of calls for police service are in fact about psychotic episodes of citizens, public drunkenness, homelessness, and so forth. None of those things are traditionally policing duties. Social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, nurses are in fact better suited to those. Now, those are the two competing perspectives. Now, but the question then becomes, what do we make of these two approaches? My standpoint, and I welcome many members of the audience to disagree with me, but my standpoint comes close to the second one, which is that there are ways in which we can change things within police and policing to ensure that the kinds of effects that we see, the kinds of consequences that we see are not so anymore. So one of those consequences is that up to 70% of police fatalities are individuals who had mental health crisis and or had substance abuse issues. Clearly, there's something wrong there. There is a disjuncture. The police are not approaching these individuals the way that they ought to, and that calls for fundamental changes. Now, we can respond to that as a society in a number of ways. One is to channel some of the funding that the police get for tackling those issues to social welfare services. Another approach is to ensure that police organizations hire as trained and sworn officers, professionals with the skills and the qualifications for dealing with those issues. At the moment, to get into the RCMP or APS and so forth, you need roughly grade 12. I have argued in multiple fora and so forth that grade 12 level education is no longer sufficient for 21st century policing. And of course, there are other measures, gender balance, accountability, the way and policies around discipline, and not allowing officers to just rack up huge disciplinary episodes in their files and so on and so forth. So all of these are ways in which these issues can be tackled. But with respect to the role of sociologists on this matter, I think in terms of what is publicly expressed, sociologists are generally very conservative people. I'm not sure, and that's a very broad brush, I'm not sure that there has been a lot of, with very few exceptions, like Carleton and with a unit at Carleton and so forth, I believe that most sociologists have either not said anything publicly about this particular issue, or in those who have said anything about it, more often than not, have pitched their tents with police as currently constituted. That seems to me, I could be wrong, but that seems to me to be the state of affairs. But what we can do is essentially present our findings, and those findings are very clear in terms of the cause and effects of these issues. And that would mean making ourselves available for any kind of work or committee tasks, assignments that may be required to shape these policies. We remain in our offices, we remain within the university campus without getting involved in that very difficult job of policy formulation and implementation. I would like to see sociologists engage in that a lot more. The other part of it, of course, is that when you have become very outspoken and your perspective is known, that may block any of those kinds of considerations, but that does not mean we stop. And that's why my approach is not some, overly idealistic, impractical, non-implementable approach. I have proposed very concrete, implementable, sober solutions that I think findings are not getting to the corridors of power in the areas where they can be utilized. So the first step, therefore, has to be popularizing, making them known, sharing them, and with the advent of social media, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth, we should be sharing those findings with the public and be available to speak with the media when and if we're called upon to share our views about social issues around us.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it seems that sometimes critical findings and recommendations make their way into the corridors of power, but not into the public. And I think that's another kind of scenario as well, right? That we might not be aware of the ways in which our work is traveling, or the public might not be aware of that. A question about critical race theory. Critical race theories have been in the forefront of the fight against institutional racism, favoritism, centering the experiences of Blacks and other peoples of color, in their interpretations of the law and its workings. What is the relevance of CRT, critical race theory, in today's discussion about race and racism in a Canadian context?
Oh, I think it's absolutely critical. This is a precursor of many, many of the conversations that we're now beginning to have. The idea that the law is not colorblind. And this is one of the fundamental presuppositions within critical race theory, that racism in the criminal justice process is not an aberration. It is normal. It is a routine, a regular practice. So I see critical race theory as front and center of a number of these issues. But what does that then mean for us? Well, what that means is, at the minimum, an acknowledgement that this issue is prevalent in society. And in a recent presentation to our department's newly minted Center for Criminological Research, I did talk about some of these issues as regards the law and the way that it works. Now, in the way that the criminal justice process currently works, I'll give an instance. In first-year law, there is the whole conversation around the common law system, the workings, essentially the minutiae of the common law. One of the fundamental tenets of the common law system is that you're tried by a jury of your peers. This is a fundamentally broken system and is responsible almost singularly for a lot of miscarriage of justice. And how does it work? Well, they select certain members of the public, and then through a preset process, select a number of people, and then they empaneled and given instructions and so on and so forth. That process is fraught with major problems. It is the reason why certain cases, particularly highly sensationalized cases in the media that we thought were slam and dunk cases, often end up in zero convictions. And people wonder what happened. Sometimes prosecutors have in fact done everything they could. Sometimes even the police have done everything they could. But because jurors are members of society, and you're asking individuals to come and perform those duties, and because they feel obligated to as citizens, but the sentiments that lie in society then become expressed in the courtroom in terms of empathy or sympathy towards an accused person who ordinarily should be found guilty. In fact, it makes it the work of the prosecutors more difficult. And I recall the case of George Zimmerman in the United States. That's the guy who killed this teenager who was walking to the home of his father's girlfriend. And he was told on the phone, don't go after him. He did and killed him and still claimed self-defense. One of the jurors, and I was in the US at the time, just about leaving UMass Boston for the U of A, and we were at a National Science Foundation sponsored workshop in Columbus, Ohio. And I recall the fear all over the place because it seemed that there would be trouble, that there might be violence. One of the jurors was on CNN the day the judgment was passed, which was a not guilty judgment, and kept talking about how she felt that judge was just trying to protect the community. And it was astonishing how she felt this camaraderie, this comfort, this support for somebody standing trial for murder. There was no evidence on earth that was going to convince her that Judge Zimmerman was guilty. But that's the trial by jury. That's how it works. There are times when it works really well, and there are times when it does not. So those are some of the issues that critical race theory has for long revealed. And therefore that necessitates reworking some of these aspects of the current criminal justice system. So instead of that, should we have a panel of judges, 3 judges instead of 1, and so no jury, 7 judges instead of 1, no jury, professionals, well-trained individuals, and presumably highly objective individuals, career adjudicators, career interpreters of the law, to look at the letter of the law and weigh the facts and then make a decision rather than the current arrangement. It's a standard question actually in first-year law, in most law schools, the brokenness of the trial by jury system. So, and critical race theory has been at the forefront, exposing some of these glaring issues within the criminal justice system.
Okay. Thank you. I think the next this next question follows well, getting back to the question of policing and you know, is policing broken or behaving as it was designed to enact itself? And so I'll just read this question. The recent public interest in age-old abolitionist knowledge has recently reasserted how contemporary examples of police brutality speak not to how policing as an institution is broken, but how it is working precisely as it was designed. From RCMP usage to clear the West to the current context of RCMP apathy in Nova Scotia. Police are, under this approach, endorsed to commit violence and support white supremacist civilian violence, to stabilize and suppress public resistance under the terms of racial capitalism and settler colonialism. This is different from the assertion that policing is broken. I wonder where you see this fitting within the current calls to defund the police.
It's a really good question. I was scribbling a few things as Sara was reading that very, very profound question. Well, yes, you can make the argument that policing is functioning precisely the way it was designed. And you would be correct to assert that. From, of course, excessive use of force by police in Canada against Indigenous people, and of course, the excessive use of force against Black people in the United States, as well as Latinos, New Zealand, Maori people, Australia, Indigenous people, in Germany, Turkish people, in Turkey, Kurdish people. You can see the patterns. It's there when you look at it, you know, even globally. And in former colonized countries like Nigeria, for instance, you still find similar instances of excessive use of force in a society where there are no races, there are no distinct racial patterns, at least not in the Euro-American sense. But it is and was a colonial creation, and that colonial hangover, and that mentality remains that they are a force, and they don't pretend that they are a service. It's still called the Nigeria Police Force. It's not a service. And therefore, they have always aligned themselves with the powers that be, regardless of what kind of government, military or civilian, regardless of what political parties are in power, they do their bidding. And the consequences of decades of doing that are now being felt on the streets of Nigeria. So this is a global problem. That's my first point about it. Now, so the origins matter. The other part of it concerns training. In Canada, that is roughly 6 months. Same in the US. And most of which is spent, or at least a significant proportion of which is spent on marksmanship rather than de-escalation techniques. And they also have a lot of room for defensive driving and so on and so forth. Things that are technically useful, but skills that you would rarely need while on the job. You can have a solid 25, 30-year policing career and never draw your gun out of its hustler. Because most of the issues you will be called to are things like dealing with abusive spouses, drunken citizens. So they've, you know, essentially of those causing public nuisance, homelessness, and so forth. Now, in other words, there is a disjuncture between the training that our police officers get and the realities of the job that they perform. And I've argued at some other public fora that it's in fact unfair to those officers themselves, that their training does not in fact prepare them for the, at least not anymore, to the realities of what they will encounter on the streets. Now, racialization is huge. In some other contexts, it is a question of social class rather than race. In Nigeria, for instance, it is a class issue rather than a racial issue. And so I like us to have this sort of Catholic and very broad global perspective about it. Race or race specifically does not have the same connotation everywhere. It's actually quite variable. It's quite malleable in different geographies. Now, so in places like Ghana, Nigeria, and so forth, it's a question of your social class and the evidence of your social class that would determine how you're dealt with by the police, whether politely or impolitely. But we must be careful about being nihilistic, and in other words, that nothing works, and therefore we give up. Abolition is massive. I'm not, and I've never called for abolishing the police. I think that at least within the Canadian context, we can still reform our police services. I would probably not say the same for certain police organizations in the US, because by the early 20th century, they had a well-established reputation for brutality. But I think that with one or two exceptions in Canada, police services, as currently constituted, can be fundamentally reformed. It's a question of flushing out those with bad disciplinary records, bringing in the right set of people with the right level of qualification and experience, and of course, redefining the ethos of the profession and the underlying philosophy of what they do. In other words, we're not trying to settle the Western frontier anymore. This is no longer the Northwest Police Force. This is different. This is 2020. These individuals are fellow citizens and must be treated with dignity and respect. Other than, again, one or two police departments in this country, I think every other one can be reformed. And I'm happy to say that the Edmonton Police is one of those I consider reformable. And most of those that I think are almost beyond redemption are not in our province. And so I think we can make those changes. I absolutely like that. I'm fascinated by that argument. But I think that we should ensure that we don't give into this feeling that nothing works. And therefore, just that's it. Yes, the conditions are horrible, but I still think that changes can be made. But those changes cannot be superficial changes. They have to be profound changes around training, around accountability, around personnel, around material and material. And I think the average person living in, say, in Canada or the US may not necessarily recognize, not explicitly, that there are police organizations elsewhere that do not routinely carry guns. In England and Wales, for instance, most of the police officers do not, in fact, routinely carry guns. They have batons, they have other things, but not guns, because they know that it's rare that they need that level of weaponry. So we need to rethink those things. We need to reimagine policing. But I'm not at a space where I think they should be abolished. I think that profound changes need to be made. And those changes are identifiable. I have written extensively about them. And I think that if we would follow those parameters, we can, in fact, change the texture of policing in Canada.
Thank you. We have one more question in the Q&A. What is the difference between fundamental systemic change and abolishment?
What is the difference between
fundamental systemic change? I think they're referring to your words previously about a fundamental reform next to abolition. So how would you
and abolishment.
Yeah.
All right. So again, you cut off towards the end, but I think I got the important parts of most important parts of your comment. Now, I think those who, as I understand it, those who are calling for abolishing the police are simply saying, let's just dissolve the police and then think of something else. I haven't seen a coherent or succinct proposal for what that would look like. And yet to see that. And I would be willing to take a look and perhaps reassess my own stance on it when I see so, but I have not come across it. What I am calling for are very specific, enforceable, implementable measures, beginning with psychological testing of potential recruits, gender balance with a minimum threshold of 40% and rising to 50% male-female ratio amongst uniformed officers. Up to accountability, I have proposed a two-tier disciplinary regimen that any police officer who kills a citizen, an unarmed citizen, has to go. They have to be let go. And again, keep in mind, being armed is not necessarily illegal. People have permits in some cases to carry weapons. The question is, were they posing any harm or risk to you? But any police officer who kills an unarmed civilian or a civilian who was armed but posed no threat should leave the force. The second part of that two-tier approach is what I've termed, again, borrowing from the whole three strikes law metaphor used back in California regarding punishment of criminals, is to say each police officer across their career has two pardonable offenses. In other words, minor issues in relation to citizens. So nobody died, nobody had any grievous bodily harm, but you abused their rights. Count one, you're warned, a letter is put in your file regarding that. Count two, same process. By count three, the third strike, such police officer should be let go, because such officers, having such officers in service, makes life difficult for police officers who do their jobs with respect for citizens. So that's another thing that we've called for. And the political environment also matters. What's coming from the mouth of the politicians and so forth. As I said in my presentation, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau signified a very clear and unambiguous political position. One of the points that I made in my CCR presentation a few days back was that protests, in fact, should be directed to the elected politicians rather than to police stations or police officers. Change in police organizations rarely come from within. It rarely happens from within. The impetus has to come from outside. Police organizations in the hundreds of years of policing literature, or anything close to a policing literature, would show that the impetus to change rarely comes from police organizations, because they are like other organizations, self-interested, self-perpetuating. Forget the discourse about service and so forth. I'm sure that's important to many in service, but it's a wonderful career path, at least in Canada and most parts of the US. Within 36 months of being an RCMP officer, for instance, mostly with grade 12 and so forth, individuals make $85,000 to $86,000 a year. That's a lot of money. Not a lot of, or not all PhD holders make that kind of money. If we're paying officers that, we should be getting value for money. And I have argued in multiple media platforms, multiple public presentations, that we should be recruiting the right kinds of people. That, I believe, is what is missing. We cannot continue to give the police uniform to somebody who is a year or two out of high school. it was setting them up for failure. Not a lot of people can handle that level of power. They are too malleable, they are too impressionable. They simply join whatever microculture exists in the department. And sometimes that is not always positive for society. We need to have a university graduate only police service, and then have accountability policies in place to ensure that people do not continue to get away with major disciplinary problems. So those are a few of the reasons why I think these are fundamental changes that are not about abolishing the police, but will go a long way in recalibrating, resetting, rearranging the DNA of policing as we know it today in Canada.
Okay, thank you, Tope. I'm not seeing any other questions pop up, but there are a number of expressions of thanks rolling through the Q&A. So know that people have very much appreciated the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And then Xiaobei, Sherry, Sara, thank you for the wonderful work. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tope. You know, just today we hear the news that the Ottawa Police Constable Daniel Montison was found not guilty of all charges in the case leading to the death of Abdi Rahman Abdi. That was 4 years ago. So it's very painful news
Right.
to the family and to the community, and it's you know, it also speaks to the importance and the urgency of this topic. So thank you so much for coming here to share your work with us, and thank you, Sara, for your great moderating, and thank you, Sherry, too, for without your behind-the-scene work, this would not have come to fruition. Thank you, and thanks to the audience for making time to attending. Bye-bye.